good. Mic is good. All right.
Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you for joining us this beautiful Sunday morning in Durban. It has been so humid this weekend. Proper
So hot.
Durban summer.
You can smell the sea everywhere you go as well. It's just humid and
Feels like
very
you can
Durban.
feel the sea. It feels like you're walking in the sea all the time. Anyway, it's a beautiful Sunday morning. And we're ready to continue this morning. So thank you for joining us, whether you're watching now or watching a little bit later. We're in the book of Corinthians, and we've probably got about this session and maybe another session left to finish off the book of Corinthians. And we're in the main chapter. Chapter 15 is like the point. Chapter 15 is about the resurrection. Not so much about the resurrection of Jesus, although it's a main point. But Paul's actually aiming to prove that there's actually a resurrection for everybody. And now we've gotten on a little bit further in which he tries to explain what that resurrection kind of is like. And so one of the little extra points here is that it's a bodily resurrection. Meaning that although Paul might have believed that it's something spiritual, it still is material, although it's made of a different type of material. But the point was always, it seems, at least for the early Jewish ideas, apocalyptic resurrection ideas, that of Jesus and that of early Paul, or the undisputed letters of Paul, was that it was going to be a bodily resurrection. Right? It's something that's going on earth, and you're going to have your body, although it's going to be a transformed body. So now the corruptible becomes incorruptible. So you have this new body, but the point is body. And so one of the important things we'll drop a little bit later in this session is that it seems to scholars that Paul is actually, there's a motive behind all of this, and there's actually specific people in the church of Corinthians that are at odds with Paul in terms of resurrection, how it works, what it looks like. And we'll get to that a little bit later. But it seems like this is the direction in which Paul is going. So we then, 2 sessions prior, we discussed like the order in which Paul thinks it's all going to take place. I think it's pretty safe to assume that a plain reading of Paul has this as one event that kind of takes place, where in a lot of Christianity today, which we would call not all Protestants, but mostly the dispensationalists, Pentecostals, and Charismatics, and today some of the newer apostolic movements, they have this as a kind of a two-phase thing. Jesus comes, takes the church, they go to heaven, then this massive destruction happens on the earth, then he comes back and then does what needs to be done. But it doesn't seem like that's the way things happen when you read Paul in a plain sense. One event, Jesus coming, resurrection, flipping the world on its head, getting rid of all evil, and then this reign starts on earth, right? Saying that, I don't think anybody, including Paul, really knew exactly how everything would work. But it doesn't seem like Paul is advocating a two-stage type of solution. All right, so you said last week we spoke about the fact that Paul makes an emphatic statement that flesh and blood cannot inherit this kingdom. And this is kind of, if you read it plainly for what it says, it's a statement that goes against a lot of what we've believed as Christians. Like, have you inherited the kingdom of God? Of course, yes, I'm saved. But Paul says flesh and blood can't really participate fully. So I think I can hear the arguments that if you're listening to what I'm saying, so he's France, but it's kind of like here but not here, and we spiritually partaking, our bodies will catch up later. And that's more like a view that developed much later, and because of the delay of this event kind of not taking place. So what we have in Paul is just a plain reading of Paul is kind of just, guys, our current state cannot contain what needs to happen. We're waiting for Jesus next Thursday. He's going to change everything, change us who are alive, resurrect those and transform those who have been dead. Then we'll be able to participate, because it's a spiritual body, but it's still a body. Yeah. So very important that we understand that Paul's idea of what is spiritual and our idea today is slightly different, right? Just again, our idea of spiritual is immaterial, invisible. It had an thought of Jesus, something that was kind of body, that could walk. The disciples believed he could eat, and etc., etc. Okay, so last week we dealt with that. So the final kind of argument for 1 Corinthians 15 is what we find in, yes, it's death, where is your sting? So if you grew up in church like me, death, where is your sting would have been a slogan that would have been very casually used by Christians to kind of confirm their current experience, you know?
Yeah.
Death, where is your sting, for Paul, is not something that's already happened. It's a slogan or a motto that can be used once Jesus comes. And
Once death has
dead are resurrected, and the death that is at work in our bodies no longer do. We are transformed. Then let me read it for you. You see that in the plain reading of Paul, it's not really something you can apply to today. All right, so verse 53 of 1 Corinthians 15 says, "For this corruptible must put on incorruption, and this mortal must put on immortality. So when this corruptible shall have put on incorruption, and this mortal shall have put on immortality, then shall be brought to pass the saying." So there's a saying that is not brought to pass until immortality overcomes mortality and incorruption overcomes corruption. And that's the saying that says death is swallowed up in victory. Okay? And it goes like this: "O death, where is your sting? O grave, where is your victory? The sting of death is in sin, and the strength of sin is in the law. But thanks be to God, which gives us the victory through our Lord Jesus Christ." So it's a little bit of a tricky subject to address because of the mixture we kind of grew up with. Like, it's always been a hard one to answer as a pastor, because I had to tell people that death had been defeated. And at the same time, while I'm standing there, we're both busy dying. Just in terms of the process of aging, and your cells are busy dying. We both are still dying, and people have died, and the people that have preached this, they have also died. So there's always been this it's a paradox saying that death's been defeated, but we're still busy dying, right? But
But
Paul,
also we understand it as kind of metaphoric, because it has no sting, because when you die, you're still alive in God.
yes, sure.
I think that's the way we also make sense
That's
of us busy
that's
dying.
how we make sense of it, yeah. But it seems like Paul's quite clear that for him this only has effect once the end of the world comes, once Jesus returns, and people don't die anymore. That's when death's sting is completely taken away. Of course, Paul would have thought, as all of us, that in the life of Jesus, he overcome sin, death, etc. So maybe he could sing that song, and maybe we can sing it in anticipation. But it seems quite clear for Paul that that's not something you preach on a Sunday and tell people that death has no more hold on them. That's because if you still die, no matter even if you live afterwards, the thing we call death that makes you stop being the person you are, living in the body you're living, that thing is still enforced, right? That thing is still here. And maybe this is part of, if you, in a moment, I'm going to address the issue that I've mentioned earlier, but it seems just like Paul is writing this whole thing to people who seem to believe that they've already participated in the resurrection. So very early on in the book of Corinthians, there's this little weird portion. Let me just see, I'll make sure I'm at the right place here. Yeah, that's fine. Let's go to that. So very early on in Corinthians, there's a weird portion. It's almost sarcastic. And it comes completely left field. It doesn't feel like it belongs in the text at that point. And it's only once you read through the whole book of the First Corinthians that you start realizing what that could have been. And so what we want to deal with today is understanding the book of Corinthians backwards from 1 Corinthians 15. Understanding 1 Corinthians 15 as the point from which you understand the rest of all the writings right throughout the book of Corinthians. So this little funny portion is found in 1 Corinthians 4 verse 8. I'm going to read it for you, and it's going to sound familiar because you would have read it many times, but it's hard it's not easy to make sense of it. Somewhere in the middle of stuff, Paul just starts saying, he says, already you have all you want. Now he's writing to the Corinthian church, right? The Corinthian church wasn't known for the high moral standards. Corinthians was a very, it was a budding metropolis. It was a beautiful capital city of one of the Roman provinces. So it was an urban area, it was buzzing and so on. But he's writing to the church then in the middle of kind of reprimanding them about all the stuff they're not getting right. He says this, but you already have all you want. Already you have become a little bit of that's a puzzle when you read that, but scholars are quite sure that what's going on here is that there were people in the Corinthian church that believed they had already partaken in the resurrection. And Paul here is in this, some say sarcastic, it seems very sarcastic because that's what sarcasm is. In a sarcastic way, he's saying, but you guys you already have everything. You've already become kings, which is pointing to the idea of reigning and ruling, which is something which is for the next age in this new creation. And so it seems to them that there were people in the Corinthian church that, and last week we spoke about people that didn't believe in the resurrection of the dead. Then there were also people who believed that they actually, through Jesus being resurrected, they have spiritually partaken of the resurrection, in such a sense that they now already are benefactors of all the great things that come with this resurrection. And then when you realize this, you start understanding Paul's entire argument in the whole book of Corinthians. Why is he pointing out all their flaws? He's trying to show them that they have not partaken of the type of resurrection life that's coming, because they still have all these things going on in the church. So if you understand that from that point of view, you start realizing that Paul is building a case
that's
all the way.
Addressing.
Yes, he's actually aiming for the resurrection. That's what he's talking about. Two main things for Paul. There's maybe three. Number one, there is a resurrection at the end. Number two, it's a bodily resurrection. And number three, it has not taken place yet. All right. So when you realize that's his angle, then you start understanding why he keeps pointing out their flaws, why he uses this book to address their inadequacies, their challenges and their problems. He's in a way trying to tell them, guys, we are not there. This hasn't happened yet. So let me just go to my notes. Some of the Corinthians came to believe that they had already participated in the resurrection of Jesus. So a kind of a realized resurrection. Now, a lot of Christians today think like this as well. Like we're not resurrected, but we already have resurrection life. Like that type of mentality. Like you're resurrected in an ethereal way, like a spiritual sense. When they say that, they mean invisible, immaterial, ethereal. On the ground, the resurrection hasn't taken place for us. And one of the reasons, and one of the ways we can show it hasn't, is look at why you guys are still living in this world. And the point of that is to say, we are still susceptible, because we have to realize that Paul's worldview was dualistic in the sense that he believed that there were these forces of evil under control of Satan and his demonic powers, that basically was running the world, and they were the cause of all the trouble, all the evil. And he was trying to, I guess, warn the church, hey, be on your guard, because you're not in that immortal, eternal state where you're kind of like immune. You're not. You're still under the influence, or you're still susceptible to the powers. And that's also how some people interpret the portion in this book where Paul's asking women to put stuff on their heads as a protection, a symbol of protection against the evil powers. Anyway, story for another day. So there were these guys in Corinthians that kind of believed that they already participated in the resurrection. They'd already gotten everything they needed. They were already kings that were ruling and reigning. They already had the full benefits of their salvation. Just once again, quickly, for Paul, salvation is not something that happens to you when you believe or when you put up your hand. Salvation is what happens at the end of time, when God transformed your body
Yeah.
into the immortal, eternal life looks like that, and you become part of this new kingdom. And so it seems like Paul was addressing that. Now let me read again what Paul says very sarcastically in 1 Corinthians 4 verse 8, just to now put it into context. Already you have all you want. Already you have become rich, quite apart from us. Which is a very important, because it seems like Paul is saying, you guys believe you're already partaken in the resurrection. I know I haven't. Quite apart from us, you have become kings.
I have a question.
Yeah.
When you're saying that he's addressing these people that have already believed that the resurrection had taken place, do you know this from, is this historically speaking, or does it say in the Bible?
No, it is deducted from the context.
By scholars or
Yeah, no. Well, scholars and well, whoever reads it.
What
but
I'm saying is this new? Is this new news?
No, it's not really new news.
That there were people in Paul's time that believed the resurrection had taken place.
Yeah,
That's what I'm asking.
that's not new news. No. But it's not so obvious when you read the book of Corinthians, because it's this little portion here that.
So that's what I'm asking. How from that portion do you know?
Well,
That's what I'm saying.
I don't know. I don't think there's any written material that we can go to outside of the Bible that could confirm this. As far as I know, I have no knowledge of it. This conclusion comes from the reading of 1 Corinthians 15 with a contextual method.
Right.
In other words, him saying this, what could he possibly mean?
Right.
And so, looking at the whole context of Corinthians, this is about the resurrection. Everything is about the resurrection.
So
And the
this is a
resurrection.
response
Yes,
to
yes.
The contextual.
Yeah, the contextual method is a way in which you, if you only have one side of the conversation, you can deduct a form of the other side. So if he is saying sarcastically, you already have all you want, you already have become rich, and you've become kings, Paul is assuming that there are people that believed at that time that they already have all they want. What is it that they want in that time? The resurrection, the kingdom of God, salvation. You already have become kings. In other words, you're already ruling and reigning. That was a promise of that kingdom.
Without that kings, it could have been understood that they're just doing well in their lives. But with now that
I
we're
would
the
say,
kings,
even without that, you could deduct that this is about the resurrection and them pulling the resurrection early. And there is one other thing, and I don't really want to go down this route because it's going to distract us. But there are portions in Ephesians that say we have already been seated with Christ in heavenly places, and that would agree with this view of some of these Corinthians. Right, it's the exact same thing. But we know now that Ephesians is not undisputed letter written by Paul, and most scholars believe that Ephesians was not written by Paul. It was written much later, once again in response to the delay of the actual apocalypse, so that people start saying maybe we've misunderstood it. It's kind of already taken place, and we're already in it. So okay, all right. I don't want to say too much.
My question.
Say too much more about that. So the point is that when we read 1 Corinthians 15, then we see that Paul he's addressing these people that believe they already realized their resurrection.
A spiritual.
Kind of today's idea of a spiritual thing that's already happened. And there are lots of Christians today that believe the same type of thing, and they will quote Ephesians for you. Right?
Yes.
So,
yes.
Okay. Yes, we're still waiting for Jesus, but I'm already resurrected. I'm a resurrected, ascended. I've died, I'm resurrected, ascended. I'm seated with Jesus. That type of thinking is very common in current Christianity. It's very hard to explain any of that. But it does seem, this is really the point, that this was not Paul's view. Paul believed in a simple process of next Thursday, next month, next year when Jesus comes, all of that happens.
Gotcha.
Right. And there are actually portions in Paul where he categorically states that don't think it's already taken place. He makes actually quite a very strong point of that. I just don't have it offhand, but maybe I should go and have a look at that and bring it up next time. Anyway, so chapter 15 is Paul's apology or Paul's reasoning for the bodily resurrection that has not come yet, right? That's important to him. The whole book seems to serve to argue that the challenges that the Corinthian church are having, the challenges they're facing is an argument against the fact or against the chance that they've already been resurrected
Yes.
and they already have the fullness of life.
Yes.
Because their claim is, we have everything we need, we are fully rich and we are kings, right? And Paul's saying, no.
That's the reason
We're
for him
still
pointing out
suffering.
all the-
Yeah, we're still suffering. We're still susceptible to nonsense. Let me tell you why. And then Paul goes, and let me just give you a quick summary here. Chapters 1 to 4 is about the divisions in the church, right? Chapter 5 is about a man sleeping with his stepmom. Right? So he's pointing out these things. Number 6 is about people, Christians, taking other Christians to law. And he's saying, guys, you can follow the argument. If you go back now and you read, he's saying, don't you know we're supposed to be judging angels? That's in the world to come, right? So why now can't you guys even judge small cases? You have to go outside to worldly courts. So that's a direct argument as we are not in the age to come, because it's obvious you guys can't even judge the smallest of cases. So if you go to each one of those,
Yeah, it's so
you
different
start,
in context, eh?
yeah, you can see them in context. And also the fornication that Paul speaks about in chapter 6 is predominantly about prostituting and going to prostitutes. And he's saying, look, you guys, he calls them saints, nobody knows why, but he says, you guys are frequenting prostitutes, you have divisions in your church. There's one guy that's sleeping with his stepmom, and this is why he's sarcastic. He's saying, you've got it all. You're kings. And he's actually saying, you guys get real, like that's in your head.
It's funny to imagine
it hasn't happened yet.
sarcasm so long ago.
Yeah. Sarcasm is not a new skill. Chapter 7 addresses issues in marriage. Chapter 8 to 10 addresses the Christians giving offense to other Christians about how they view the interpretation of whether they should eat meat sacrificed to idols. Chapter 11 is about head covering in the church. And then chapter 12 to 14 is one we kind of skipped over. It's about the spiritual gifts. And it's actually quite an interesting one, because when you go read chapters 12 to 14 of Corinthian church, the weird thing is that often people will use these portions to motivate that everyone, there's a portion there, and I'm paraphrasing, where it says, does everyone have a prophecy and a gift and something to say? And people will quote that and say, you see, everybody is supposed to have something to say. But if you just use, I won't say half your brain, sorry, apologies. If you use all of your brain and you read the whole portion, you realize that Paul's asking a question because it's a call for order. Because he's saying, guys, it's chaos where you works are. Everyone needs to say something. Everyone wants to be a prophet. Everyone, let things happen in order. That's the point of the whole thing. And in larger context, he's saying that because he's saying, guys, you haven't arrived. Some oaks get drunk and eat too much of the communion before everybody else comes. It's a mess. How can you say this is what the salvation?
How can this be it?
Yeah, this cannot be it. So the very existence of all these problems for Paul, then, he builds the case slowly to show that they have not partaken. Nobody has partaken of this resurrection that Jesus is the forerunner of. It is something that's coming. It hasn't come yet. That's important. Number 2, maybe it's imminent. It's bodily. There's another one. It's just slipped my mind. But anyway, those are the main, that it is actually coming. So it seems to us, if we read it like this, that 1 Corinthians is about the resurrection from the dead. It's an argument against certain other positions. It seems like there's at least 2 other positions that pops up in the Corinthian church. Number 1, there is no resurrection from the dead. So Paul uses, in that argument, he uses the resurrection of Jesus and some of the very early hymns, if you remember that little portion about Jesus' resurrection and the witnesses that saw it, as a proof that he's the first fruits of this massive harvest that's coming. So that's number 1. The second argument it seems to oppose is this idea that it's already happened and we are spiritually partaking of it and we already have the fullness of it manifesting in our lives right now. And Paul's saying, no, guys, there's still a lot of tribulation, there's still a lot of suffering that's busy taking place. The kind of resurrection I'm talking about gets rid of these things. And maybe this is a good place to just talk about 1 Corinthians 13, the chapter about love. But what does the chapter about love do? Well, it sits directly after Paul addressing chaos in the communion and the use of spiritual gifts in the church. And that's why, I just realized this week, Joy, for the first time in my entire life, that's why he says, you can prophesy, you can this, you can have all knowledge, you can give all everything to the poor, you can have all faith. But if you don't have love, you're a banging cymbal. And what's kind of going on there is saying what is coming in the resurrection is not going to be the banging cymbal you guys are banging. It's rather going to look like love. And then he makes an emphatic point. He's saying all these other things will be no more. Like, and so you could actually use that portion as an argument for Paul. Like, how do we know the resurrection's taken place? Well, you don't need prophecy or knowledge anymore. You don't need all these things come to an end. And the only thing that sits well and sits eternally is this love, this agape love that he explains so beautifully in 1 Corinthians 13. So you can actually go back to each one of these chapters and see how it fits into the larger context of Paul saying, what you have here is not what's coming, and this is the proof that you're not there. So it's a very powerful argument when you read it back like this, and it also makes sense. That's a context in which everything in that book makes perfect sense. It actually comes together. It's a massive apologetic for there is a resurrection, it's bodily, and it hasn't happened yet. So it's actually beautiful if you think. And a lot of people, scholars, when they read it this way, they see the beauty of Paul's writing and the mastery that he had of the rhetoric, because most, they would have been trained in rhetoric as rhetoric as a Pharisee, and Paul, who possibly had some Greek training, being someone who could write Greek in this way. It's an amazing rhetoric. Rhetoric. It's an amazing rhetoric. It's amazing how he weaves
can
it.
put into words something that's
He weaves it together beautifully in this portion. So how are we doing for time then? 27. Okay, great. All right. So that's kind of how we look, how we read Corinthians backwards, is by saying the end, Corinthians 15, will explain to you why he's talking about everything else throughout this chapter. So I think this is a good time that we could, oh, my iPad's doing that funny move on me. Oh, come on. Oh, yes. Okay, great. Okay, so I want to finish up then 1 Corinthians today by doing a little interesting exit. And I need to do this because we've said a lot about the resurrection and about the apocalypse, but something that keeps popping up, and maybe something that you would have picked up along the line, is that this thing we've been talking about, this thing that Paul's been talking about, it hasn't happened. Right? We could use all of Paul's arguments in 1 Corinthians to show that in today's church,
use the same
it
arguments.
hasn't happened, right? You just look at your own life and you know. Okay, so Paul believed it was imminent. Paul believed it hadn't taken place. We can use all the same arguments to say it hasn't taken place yet. Do we now believe it's imminent? And that would, to me, that would be a complete abuse of this literature to believe that because Paul believed it was imminent, we have to believe it's imminent for 2023. Like, I can't go there because it doesn't make any sense to me. Paul believed it was imminent for his time, not for our time. But that leaves us with a massive dilemma. What do we do with this idea of apocalyptic salvation? What do we do with it because it never happened? It was imminent and it didn't happen. What now? So what a lot of Christians do is they say, okay, well, it's imminent for us. There we go. Paul says shortly, so that means shortly, so that means we're reading it 2,000 years later, it means shortly. To me, that's not a good logic to use here. But what else can you do with this? So there are basically three options. You got to either push it forward indefinitely and say, here shortly means our shortly. Okay, something I can't grab a hold of. The second thing is you could spiritualize the whole thing, right? And then that goes against...
Yeah,
exactly. So it goes against Paul's argument. Paul's actually, this whole book is an argument for don't spiritualize this. This is a bodily thing. It'll happen and then everything will be different. that hasn't happened. So the only option really for me is to consider the possibility that Paul had, as he mentions in Corinthians 13,
Sees in part.
he sees in part and he's inspired or prophesies in part. That he did not have the full picture. That whatever it is that God had inspired in him had to come through the Paul's filter onto the pages. And here's where it helps to know a bit of history and to have studied a bit of the history of religion, specifically the Jewish religion, is we know that Paul's filter, what was Paul's filter? Paul's filter is Second Temple Judaism, which is highly apocalyptic. In other words, it's something that was there. It wasn't in the Torah, but by the time Jesus and Paul arrives, this thing is pregnant. I mean, if you know the history of the Jews a little bit, you'd know for the previous 2 centuries, the Jews have been pregnant with this thing. Like they literally expect
like
the apocalypse any moment.
Just like we have certain expectations because it's like built into us from where we come from.
Yeah.
That was the same for Paul.
Yeah.
Built in
Exactly.
like from where he came from.
So
So there's no question that there could be any other way.
Yeah. So now you receive inspiration, and let's say legitimately Paul received inspiration from God, like God was really busy talking to him, and he's inspired by God to write. That inspired by God to write doesn't mean God writes the actual words. But what it does mean is that whatever comes through Paul comes through the filter of Second Temple Judaism, which is apocalyptic in nature. So just the word inspired means to be God breathed, and when you blow up a balloon, for instance, this might help a little bit. When you blow up a balloon, the breath might be your breath, but it takes the shape of the rubber. When you blow a balloon, it doesn't go in the shape of your breath. It goes in the shape of the rubber. But what does it have inside? It has the breath inside. And so I like to think about inspiration in that way, that Paul's writing takes the form of the rubber, and the rubber is Judaism, is Paul's filter. Yeah, well, I mean, you gotta find some way of thinking through this clearly. So, let me just get to my little piece of notes here. So, do we assume that he got the timing wrong? And I would say yes. Do we assume that the whole apocalyptic thing is possibly in part? I would also say yes. So, what do we hold on to? I would suggest we hold on to the end, the goal of this whole scenario, which is God all in all, and that we be humble enough to
not know,
to know that we actually don't know how this will exactly happen, but that's kind of the goal that sits well in my heart,
and
if I can say.
it feels, for lack of a better word, safer than to be certain, 100% certain on a specific point. It just feels it, because we can be certain that God loves us, that there is a God, and that we are His, and that is more safer or reliable to sit in than one specific event.
Oh, exactly, that date.
Yes.
I mean, I watched a documentary or an interview yesterday again with one of the famous dispensationalist guys, John Hagee, and he's written so many books that we pinpoint the apocalyptic time, the coming of Jesus. He's written a new one because the other ones were wrong, and really what he's just doing is doing what's happened throughout all history from the time of Daniel. Everyone's pinpointing the apocalypse. It doesn't happen. So at some point we've got to realize maybe the idea of a and I'll say sectarian apocalypse, because it's got this idea that this little holy huddle, they'll make
group,
it. Maybe that idea has got more to do with Judaism than what it's got to do with God, and maybe the God all in all will happen in a different way. So I just want to say this at the end. I want to read what I've written down here as we finish off here today. Do we assume that the ideas are inspired, but sometimes the form in which it come has been filtered through Paul's own context of Jewish apocalypticism, and that the God all in all dream is still alive in the mind of God, but just not in the way or the timing that Paul might have had in mind, and therefore not in the way and the timing we have in mind. and many other New Testament writers. And maybe this dream of perfection, of maturity, of love, like we see in 1 Corinthians 13, of the creation, it's not apocalyptic in that it happens in an event. Maybe it's not sectarian in that it's for a few guys in a little corner somewhere. Maybe it's not one event that happens at the end of time, but another possibility is it could be that it's built into the fabric of existence, that God is slowly moving us in that direction, that it's more a process than an event that happens at some point. If we look at our universe is constantly tending to complexity, and it's mind-boggling that it's doing that. It should just be randomly, right? It just should be, there should be no direction, but it seems like our universe is this universe that comes from God. It moves towards complexity. So it seems like it's a driving force behind it. The point just simply being that maybe God is dealing with evil powers and forces, not in the way that Jewish apocalypticism wants him to do it. Maybe these things are internal, and he's slowly dealing with it in us. And that it's not someone coming on a white horse with a big sword, whacking everyone and throwing the devil into the abyss, but he's actually busy with a process that is busy cleaning humanity of the stuff that we know causes the suffering and the pain, etc., etc. And that kind of moves us into the direction of his image and his likeness, slowly allowing us to see clearer and clearer the face of our origin lover God, and transforming and resurrecting us from the death of our selfishness into the perfection of his agape love. So the point I'm trying to make is, if Paul got this slightly wrong, it could be that the timing and the method might just be wrong, right? And that God, all in all, could be the result of a long-term process. That resurrection could be the result of a long-term process. That ascension could be the result of a long-term process, and it doesn't necessarily look the way we want it to look. And so, I've kind of come to the conclusion that apocalyptic sectarian religion, because believe me, Christianity is not the only one. There are many of them. It's failed. It's failed over and over and over again, and its expectations have failed over and over and over again. And maybe it's time we just say, God, do what you want to do, how you want to do it, in the way that you want to do it. So I want to end off Corinthians like that, to say that's an idea of what Paul was looking at. And if we look at that in terms of what we've done in Galatians, we've done in 1 Thessalonians, that's Paul. That's early Paul, or what scholars would call authentic Paul, or undisputed Paul. It looks different to what Christianity looks like today. And it also looks different to what Christianity looked like 50 years after Paul's life, when some of these other books are being written. It's simple, as far as it can be simple, but it's Jewish apocalypticism. At the end, everything's going to happen. Boom. Maybe that's just not the way things are going to be. So anyway, I'll leave you with that to ponder at least. I'm not sure where we're going next week. I've got actually no idea. I haven't thought about it really, but I guess we should go into the next book, 2 Corinthians, because it's also authentically Paul. I think we'll do that. Yeah. All right. Thank you so much for being with us today. Have a wonderful Sunday, and we'll see you next week.
Next time.